Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is ceasefires. How do you say ceasefire in Arabic? Time to reload. This is a joke in Israel, going around all over the place. The United States has publicly acknowledged that during the Israeli-Hamas ceasefire, Hamas successfully recruited and began to train 20,000 eager to fight for their cause. These recruits, young and even very young, are old enough to carry a weapon and to plant a bomb. In English, the concept of a ceasefire is pretty straightforward and pretty clear. A compound word, ceasefire, combining the words cease and fire, it clearly means stop fighting. The word armistice is a little more complicated. It's derived from the Latin. In Latin, arma means arms or weapon, because the weapon was the extension of your arm. Stitz means to stand, as in the expression stand down, which means put down your weapons. Well, that's what it means. The best example of an armistice is the armistice that led to the end of World War I, which became the foundation for the Treaty of Versailles, and subsequently the creation of the League of Nations, which then becomes the United Nations. As an interesting aside, one of the only things many people remember from their high school history class is that World War I ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. In Arabic, and in the history of the war in the Islamic world, a ceasefire is nowhere near being that clear and simple as it is in English. There is more than one word for ceasefire and peace in Arabic. And understanding these 3 or 4 terms used for ceasefire and for peace is extremely important. Our Western sensibilities have difficulty grasping the Arab world's essential definitions and the result of that in the art of negotiations. Western diplomats are severely handicapped. In Arabic, the word most often used in discussing a ceasefire is hudna. The word hudna, according to the Encyclopedia of Islam, is a halt in hostilities in order to rearm, just like the joke I told. I repeat, the term is most often used in the Arab world for ceasefire as hudna, and the official definition of hudna is to stop fighting in order to rearm. There are certain caveats for a hudna. It cannot last more than 10 years, and it can be broken at any time. The next most commonly used word in the Arab world is tadiyah. Defined as a temporary cessation of fighting, a tadiyah too can be broken at any time. And then there is a hubadiyah. A hubadiyah is a 10-year truce, named after the treaty created in 628 of the Common Era by the Prophet Muhammad with Quraysh, the Quraysh tribe. It's sometimes referred to as the Quraysh Treaty. The original Hubadiyah Treaty lasted for a mere 2.5 years, not 10, before it was abrogated. Israel's treaty with Egypt, which was signed in 1979, and the Jordanian treaty in 1994, which we were at that signing, referred to the Sulha, or Sulha Muhada. These are treaties, peace treaties, that come about through negotiations. Hamas, like other Islamic leaders, draw inspiration from Islamic history. Their analysis and current points of view are heavily informed by history, by their history. They view the current modern-day conflict with Israel through the lens of the Crusaders. In their view, their conflict with Israel is akin to the 200-year span of the Crusaders and their failed attempt to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims. Like the Crusaders, Hamas and many other Muslim leaders see Israel as only a temporary problem. They firmly believe that Israel will run away, defeated, just like the Crusaders, thereby leaving Muslim lands for Muslims to control. Particularly important in the minds of Hamas and other Muslim leaders is the 1192 Treaty of Ramallah between Saladin and Richard the Lionhearted. That hudna, and that's what it was called, a hudna, which lasted 3 years and 3 months, ended the Third Crusade. By the way, that's another great memory device learned in high school history classes to remember the dates. And that explains how and why what we Westerners believe to be legitimate ceasefires signed with Hamas are broken time and time again. It also explains when they are broken after they reload. In the minds of Hamas's leaders, Hamas will always be in a state of war with Israel. Hamas is in this conflict for the long run. This current conflict with Israel is simply a temporary setback for them. A ceasefire is to be used as a time to regroup and rearm. Then, true to form, attack again. This explains why we've seen this scenario play out so many times before. It leaves Israel with only one choice. The Jewish state, too, needs to take a page out of history, out of American history. The only way to resolve this problem, this conflict with Hamas, is to do what the U.S. did with Japan at the end of World War II. In their mind, and according to their culture, the Japanese were simply incapable of losing. The United States had no choice other than to orchestrate such a dramatic loss that it was impossible for Japan not to recognize their loss. A destruction so horrific, so dramatic, that it crippled an entire generation and lingers to this very day. I do not, however, think that Israel can or will do anything like what the U.S. did in Japan. That is certain. I'm not advocating it, I'm just saying. And that means that the war with Hamas will continue for a very long time. First up is a column from Ynet. It was published on March 4th, 2025, and it was penned by Shlomo Yanai. It is entitled The Flaws of Deterrence: Why Israel Must Rethink Its Strategy. Subtitled, Opinion: History shows deterrence is just an educated guess. October 7th has shown enemies may act on ideology or launch surprise attacks, proving deterrence unstable and unreliable. The thesis is brilliant, and it is absolutely correct. Deterrence is not a viable answer to security in the Middle East, certainly with Israel in defending itself. If so, then what is? That begins the problem, and this is how Shlomo Yanai begins his piece. Deterrence is traditionally viewed as one of the three pillars of Israel's national security doctrine, alongside early warning and decisive victory. It is based on the assumption that adversaries will refrain from attacking out of fear of severe retaliation. However, despite its importance, deterrence is an elusive and problematic concept, raising the question of whether it should serve as a fundamental principle of shaping security policy and strategy. The failure of deterrence is not a modern phenomenon. It has accompanied humanity since its earliest days. The biblical story of the tree of knowledge. God warned Adam, "On the day you eat from it, you will surely die." Yet, Adam chose to eat the forbidden fruit, demonstrating a fundamental flaw in deterrence. It does not guarantee the prevention of the threats. Deterrence relies on both adversaries' interpretation of the threat and the credibility and determination of the entity issuing it. What if the enemy is not rational and does not apply the variables that you are applying when you're applying your deterrence? He explains, at its core, deterrence operates in the psychological and perceptual sphere. Its goal is to convince the enemy that the cost of aggression outweighs its potential benefits. But this is where the challenge lies. How can one accurately assess how an adversary perceives the severity of the consequences or the credibility of the threat? History shows that gauging the impact of deterrence on an enemy is nothing more than an educated guess. States and terrorist organizations may interpret deterrent threats differently from how they were intended, especially over time. Moreover, deterrence assumes a rational calculation of costs versus benefit. The idea is if the expected price of the aggression is too high, the adversary will refrain from action. However, this assumption does not always hold true. Enemies are often driven by ideological and religious beliefs, which do not conform to materialistic rationality. Political and military leadership operate within a broad and complex set of considerations, and history is filled with cases where nationalistic, political, or personal motivations outweigh rational calculations. Now Yanai argues that deterrence is simply not stable, and you cannot rely on it. It changes all the time, and it changes over time. The same calculation today is not the same calculation tomorrow. certainly not one decade to another. He writes, additionally, deterrence is not a stable model, but rather a temporary state that erodes over time. It is difficult to measure its effectiveness both for the deterring party and the deterred. Internal political shifts, geopolitical changes, and military developments alter an adversary's strategic calculus, leading to reassessment of risks. Over time, enemies may test the limits of deterrence, as seen in Hezbollah's provocation along Israel's northern border in 2023. Paradoxically, continuous challenges to deterrence can result in the deterring party becoming hesitant, fearing the consequences of using force. Yanai now concludes that deterrence must be removed as a pillar of defense. If it is relied upon, it will yield mistakes and incorrect conclusions and calculations. And he writes, for all these reasons, deterrence cannot serve as the cornerstone of Israel's national security doctrine. It should be regarded as a desirable byproduct of military, political, and economic growth, but not as a principle on which to rely. Dependence on deterrence fosters rigid thinking, ultimately leading to strategic miscalculations. I might add there, October 7th. He continues, instead, Israel must embrace a doctrine of prevention, proactively denying adversaries their capabilities and motivations to act against it in the first place. This is an excellent column and deeply insightful. Thank you, Shlomo Yanai. Next up is a column by Ovid Lobel, and it was published in Ynet on March 30th, 2025. It's entitled, Trump Needs to Hit Iran Where It Hurts. Tehran, not Yemen. Opinion. It is paramount, therefore, that the current campaign be augmented and that the administration's bite matches its bark. This is how Lobel begins. The Trump administration's renewed bombing campaign against the Houthis in Yemen features the correct rhetoric against the Iranian regime, but so far appears short on translating that rhetoric into kinetic action. If U.S. President Donald Trump wishes to avoid yet another unsuccessful, costly failure, both financially and in terms of munitions expenditure, to restore freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, the current operation will need to be expanded. It must include a ground component using local Yemeni anti-Houthi forces, a far more dedicated interdiction element, and strikes targeting the Iranian regime itself. Thus far, although the operation is clearly coercive rather than merely defensive or retaliatory, and not calibrated to avoid casualties or reduce escalation risks, both steps in the right direction, it appears to be more aggressive version of the Biden administration's Operation Poseidon Archer. Lobel explains that it is unlikely that the U.S. strikes will make any impact, he writes. But no matter how intense the U.S. bombings gets, it's very unlikely to force the Houthis to halt attacks. Any successful operation would have to involve substantial strikes against the Iranian regime, something the administration at least rhetorically recognizes. President Trump posted on his Truth Social platform on March 17th, every shot fired by the Houthis will be looked upon from this point forward as being shot fired from the weapons and leadership of Iran. And Iran will be held responsible and suffer the consequences. And those consequences will be dire. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz also emphasized that Iranian targets would be on the table. Lobel now explains that the U.S. needs to act against Iran, not talk again and again. He writes, to date, however, no such action has been taken. Thus, Iranian assets in or near Yemen, particularly intelligence ships like the Peshad and the Safis, are critical targets to degrade the IRGC's capacity to close the Red Sea or attack Navy vessels. Furthermore, the actual decision makers behind the Houthi piracy are in Tehran, not Sana'a. It is they who need to face not only economic pressure, but also targeted strikes that threaten their ability to control their regional Islamic empire, of which Yemen is but a satrapy. Now Lobel concludes that Trump does not want to be bogged down in any foreign war. He writes that the U.S. needs to act and attack Iran in a serious way. Unfortunately, Trump has made very clear, in word and deed, over the past decade that he's not interested in getting involved in the serious overseas conflict, suggesting that the chances of serious strikes against the Iranian regime targets are slim. If the administration's rhetoric reflects its actual intent and is translated into concrete action, then this campaign could eventually succeed where others have failed. The alternative, in which, despite the administration's tough rhetoric, the U.S. ineffectively bombs the Houthis for several days or weeks with no ground component, no increased interdiction campaign, and no strikes against the Iranian regime, is likely to dramatically embolden already emboldened Western adversaries. It is paramount, therefore, that the current campaign be augmented and that the administration's bite matches its bark. Thank you, Ovid Lobel, for an excellent analysis of the situation about the United States and Iran. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 6 cartoons today. The first cartoon looks like a keffiyeh, a Palestinian headscarf. The white in the keffiyeh are body bags. The title of this cartoon is 50,000 Dead in Gaza. Their numbers are so exaggerated. If you remember, we went over this with the statistics professor from University of Pennsylvania, who explained that it is impossible to arrive at these numbers, especially because almost every person who was listed as dead is either a woman or a child, and almost no men between the ages of 18 and 35, the ages of Hamas fighters who were the targets of Israel's strikes. The numbers are totally off. Ramadan ends, and there is a Muslim holiday called Eid al-Fitr. It is a 3-day holiday of celebration, just after Ramadan. Here the cartoon has the Grim Reaper in Gaza as he's carrying body bags. Also awful. This cartoon is entitled Gaza Children Blood Balloons. This is simply an awful depiction of the situation in Gaza itself. This next cartoon depicts Bibi on a mechanical bull or rocket, and Trump is at the speed controls. The blood is all around. This cartoon is entitled Gaza War Rodeo Bomb. Sometimes the imagery is so sick, but this is what people are seeing in the press, especially the European press. This 5th cartoon depicts Bibi holding a dove of peace hostage. It's his hat. But it is going to the bathroom all over him. The cartoon is entitled War, Peace, Hostage Dove, Poop. This is simply gross. Finally, this last cartoon, the 6th cartoon, shows an arm chopped off by an Israeli cleaver. The arm is in the shape of Gaza. It is bloody and hanging on a hook. The cartoon is entitled Gaza Slaughter, Israel War Crimes, Carnage. Just an awful depiction. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Senator Bernie Sanders pledged that he would force votes next week on resolutions that would block $8.8 billion in arms sales to Israel, citing the human rights crisis faced by Palestinians in Gaza after Israel's bombardment of the enclave and the suspension of aid deliveries. He's quoted here saying, Netanyahu has clearly violated U.S. and international law in this brutal war, and we must end our complicity in the carnage, unquote. Sanders, an independent who caucuses with the Democrats, said in a statement announcing his plan, a decades-long tradition of strong bipartisan support for Israel in the U.S. Congress means the resolution is most likely to stop. They're not going to succeed in stopping weapons sales. But backers of the resolution hope that raising the issue will encourage Israel's government and the U.S. administration to do more to protect civilians. That's their objective. Harvard University has announced the suspension of its collaboration between Birzeit University near Ramallah due to concerns about its links to Palestinian terrorist organizations. After the expiration of the last memorandum of understanding between the schools, the Harvard School of Public Health, the only body that collaborates with the Palestinian University, decided to freeze relations with the academic institution. However, collaborations between individual researchers can continue. The move comes amid pressure from the Trump administration on universities to deal with anti-Semitism. Gazan demonstrations against Hamas continue for several days. In Saraya Square in downtown Gaza City, where one of the terrorist organization's hostage return ceremonies was held, the crowd was shouting, "Hamas out, Hamas out." On a lighter note, Israel will perform the 14th song in the second semi-final of the Eurovision Song Contest, out of 16 countries competing on May 15th on the stage in Switzerland. Yuval Raphael will perform the song "A New Day Will Rise," and the competition experts said that this is a good place in terms of the order of performances. It's similar to where Eidan Golan's performance was last year. 14 members of Congress from both the Democratic and Republican parties wrote to the Nobel Prize Committee recommending that the Nobel Prize be awarded to the families of the hostages for their work in raising awareness of the plight of their loved ones held captive by Hamas. According to leaders of the initiative, Democrat leader Brad Schneider and Republican leader Max Miller, the awarding of the prize would be a recognition of the fundamental principle of the sanctity of human life and the uncompromising struggle for justice. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the visa of the Turkish student detained in Boston was revoked because Washington would not provide visas for people who participate in movements involved in vandalizing universities, harassing students, taking over buildings. He did not provide evidence on whether Rumesia Öztürk participated in those activities. Rubio, speaking at a press conference in Guyana, said the number of students' visas the State Department has revoked may be more than 300. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian is taking part in the Islamic Republic's El-Quds Day events alongside other senior members. The defense minister issued a threatening message stating, and I'm quoting here, "We will not yield to American threats and pressure. The enemies should not take risks as they will receive an appropriate response." The parliamentary speaker continued, "Any attack on Iran will set the entire region ablaze." This next piece is a really big deal and a new development in the region. The Lebanese army reported that it had located the rocket launchers used to attack Kiryat Shmona in Israel. The launchers were found near the village of Kaikait al-Jizr, north of the Litani River. The army said it was investigating who was responsible for the rocket fire and will continue to take the necessary steps to monitor the developments. The director and associate director of Harvard University's Center for Middle East Studies have stepped down. The New York Times reported this, and this is in all the papers now, following criticism of the department's alleged anti-Israel bias, and as the university faces heightened federal scrutiny over anti-Semitism on campus. The departures of Kemal Kafadar, a professor of Turkish studies, and Rosie Bashir, a historian of the Middle East, come amid broader tensions surrounding academic freedom, political discourse, and campus climate. According to the report, the two were asked by Hoppy Hoekstra, Dean of Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences, to prepare to discuss how their programs aligned with university goals of ideological diversity, respectful engagement with controversial topics. James Chisholm, the spokesperson for the Faculty of Arts and Science, declined the comment, calling the matter personal. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Former Israeli hostages held captive by Hamas have broken their silence, and they're speaking to news outlets and groups about their horrific experiences. One of those former hostages is Eli Sharabi, held by Hamas for 491 days, in underground tunnels mostly. Upon his release, Eli learned that his wife and 2 daughters were murdered by Hamas. This is a news clip of Eli sharing his experience with Ilana Dayan of Uvda on Channel 12 Israel News. It is extremely poignant and powerful. We saw him present in front of the UN Security Council 2 shows ago, where he asked where was the Red Cross, where was the UN. In this short clip, Eli describes how he garnered the strength to survive the horrific experiences of being kidnapped by Hamas. I strongly recommend that you watch the entire show on YouTube and Channel 12's Uvda. Let's watch it.
בשלושה הימים הראשונים אני כפות בידיים מאחורה, כפות ברגליים עם חבלים שקוראים לי את הבשר, וקצת אוכל, קצת מים ביום. אני זוכר שאני לא מצליח להירדם מהכאבים, כי גם החבלים כבר בתוך הבשר, וכל תנועה אתה רוצה לצרוח, וגם אתה כפות עם ידיים מאחורה, אז הכתפיים נורא כואבות, ושום תנוחה לא מספיק טובה, ואז יש רגעים שאתה פשוט מתעלף. אתה מתעלף, אתה מאבד את ההכרה, מתעורר אחרי שעתיים, 3, והכאבים ממשיכים, ואני מתחנן בפניהם שיורידו שיעבירו לפחות את הקשירה של הידיים קדימה, ואז אני אהיה רגוע, הכל יהיה בסדר. והם לא מסכימים, אבל אחרי 3 ימים מורידים לנו את החבלים.
רק לפני רגע היית חבר קיבוץ, עם אישה ו2 בנות, עם עבודה נהדרת, עם חיים נפלאים, ופתאום אתה זרוק בעזה, כפות ידיים ורגליים.
כן.
אתה שואל את עצמך, רגע, מה נהיה?
אני לא עסוק בזה, כי אני מבין כבר את הסיטואציה, ואני יודע שלהתבוסס בתוך סיטואציה לא מקדמת אותי לשום מקום. אתה מנהל את ההישרדות שלך כל הזמן ומחפש פתרונות כל הזמן. כואב לך, אתה מחפש שלא יכאב לך. אתה רעב, אתה מחפש לא להיות רעב. אתה מבין שאין שליטה, שאתה נתון בידי אחרים, עדיין בתוך הכאוס הזה, אתה מנסה קצת לקחת את השליטה.
וזה יוצר שליטה בתוך האין שליטה.
בדיוק, כל הזמן.
This is truly heartbreaking, but important for people to hear. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.